start.
Okay, so this is for question 2. I will be responding to the second option, Tarzan and genre. I was originally going to do fantasy with Game of Thrones and the Hobbit question, but I actually was looking into Tarzan and I thought that it also is fantasy, and it got me thinking. So my argument is that it is a fantasy. It's been classified as all different genres, obviously, but looking at it through those lenses, it could be a sci-fi, romance, whatever. I'll be looking at it through the lens of fantasy, and it's fantasy for the civilized human. Here we actually have. So fantasy is actually all about escapism, and Zizek actually speaks about this kind of thing. And he says that the standard way that fantasy works within ideology is that of a fantasy scenario which obfuscates the true horror of realism. Now, he's talking about fantasy as in mental fantasy, but it actually applies here because basically Tarzan is actually a sad tale, a fantasy of escaping to the real world. It's like a low fantasy in that it's set in the real world. It goes more high fantasy maybe if you read the other books where it goes to space and does all this crazy shit. But in the very first one, Tarzan of the Apes, it's almost a low fantasy. It's like a world that we could see peering through the cracks of our world. And the interesting thing about that is it's our own world, but we were so disconnected from it with industrialization that actually it is a fantasy and we can only reach it through fiction now. And so again, elaborating further, Zizek says, fantasy is not the subject's own, but the other's desire. And so what this means actually is that fantasy comes from society. It's actually not your fantasy. It kind of goes with the cultural fears of that time or whenever you are. So right now you're afraid of AI. You might have a boom in sci-fi novels or sci-fi movies and shows. And so then in an industrial world, in the time it's made, booming, Great Depression, World War I happens, things like that. We are so far from our roots in the wild, like natural world, that it is a fantasy, and that's why it explodes in mass popularity, because people want to go back to their roots, but they actually can't. They're like separated from themselves, their own core desires. And so here in the Zizek reader, we actually have more on this. So they say, what is the problem with fantasy? So, fantasy stages a desire, but whose desire? Not the subject's desire, not their own desire. What we encounter at the very core of fantasy formation is the relationship of the desire of the other. Fantasy is a way for the subject to answer the question of what object they are for the other, in the eyes of the other, for the other's desire. That is to say, what does the other see in them? What role do they play in the other's desire? So here we would have the other being society. We are little like cogs in a machine at this stage, and basically this is like the desire to escape that and go back to like natural living. Does the genre of fantasy change the perception and reception of Tarzan? Yes. If you're looking at it as a romance, it would be an exotic romance. If you're looking at it through the lens of a fantasy, it is now like a sad morality tale of how we've lost our roots and must fantasize about them. And so Fisk, again, comes back onto this, and he actually says, he actually speaks about how Indigenous Australians were really sympathetic to Rambo, and basically this is about how the audience and their perception of it will find it pleasurable. So the Aboriginals' meaning for Rambo were pleasurable because they were relevant, functional meanings produced from the text, not by it. So here we see that meaning comes from it. We construe it. It isn't dictated by the text itself. So we can now like infer what the reality is, and what we're fantasizing about. And in this case, it is escaping the real world to get to the real world. Quite ironic. Again, here we have Zizek come in. Sorry, I can't see. And he says, the real is that which is both inside and outside of the subject, resisting the symbolic's endeavors to contain it. At its simplest, it is that which we are ardently desiring, imagining it to be in the possession of the other. So we see the world and we like want to get to it, this real world, but we can't because we're trapped in our like lives. It's quite like Frankfurtian. So it's about the return of the repressed, the return of nature in the civilized world, and it's kept separate. So and in conclusion, the 20th century, we saw rapid industrialization. The themes in this book were just as relevant then as they are now, and that's why we see like timeless, many parodies, many adaptations, remakes, and it's actually ironic because this theme of industrialization and like the breaking of that yoke is ironic because the Tarzan novels themselves went on to explode into like mass popularity, mass production. And so this escapism is actually at odds with the huge mass production of Tarzan. Through the industrial boom, he succeeded, Edgar Burroughs. But it's actually, you can see it as a fantasy of escaping industrialization. Thank you. Don't clap, I have to cut that out.